In June 1941, ordinary Muscovites made a choice that changed the course of history. Factory workers and office employees, students and teachers, 400,000 people enlisted in the People's Militia to defend their capital with rifles in their hands. They were not professional soldiers, but they became heroes. Their feat saved Moscow and showed the whole world the unbreakable spirit of the Soviet people. This is the story of how civilians became an army. Subscribe to the channel to learn more about the little-known pages of the Great Patriotic War. What do you think about the decision to involve the civilian population in the defense of Moscow? Was it a necessary measure or a manifestation of popular patriotism? Share your opinion in the comments. June 22, 1941, forever changed the life of the Soviet Union. At 4 o'clock in the morning, without a declaration of war, German troops crossed the state border. By the evening of the first day of the war, it was clear that the enemy was serious and intended to reach Moscow. The Kremlin understood that the regular army, no matter how powerful it was, might not be able to withstand the onslaught of the well-trained German military machine. Additional forces were needed, and only the citizens themselves could provide them. On June 27th, just 5 days after the start of the war, the State Defense Committee passed a resolution to create a people's militia. The decision was unprecedented. For the first time in the history of modern warfare, the state officially called on the civilian population to take up arms to defend the capital. The initiative did not come only from above. A wave of patriotic rallies swept across Moscow, where workers and employees themselves demanded to be given rifles and sent to the front. The Moscow City Party Committee and the Moscow City Council launched a large-scale propaganda campaign. Appeals were heard in every enterprise and every institution. The enemy is rushing towards Moscow. Let's stand in its way. Such slogans appeared throughout the city. Large factories such as Serp I Molot, the Likachev factory, and Krasny Proletary responded particularly actively. Entire battalions were formed here from workers in a single workshop or department. The enthusiasm was remarkable. People signed up for the militia as families. Fathers with sons, brothers, even women demanded to be enrolled in combat units. Old men well over 50 and teenagers barely 16 came to the recruitment centers. The military registration and enlistment offices could not keep up with the applications. In the first week, more than 100,000 people signed up in Moscow. But this was only the beginning of a grand mobilization of the people. However, the romantic mood of the first days quickly collided with harsh reality. There was a catastrophic shortage of weapons and military uniforms. Many of those who signed up for the militia continued to work in their usual places, waiting for the call. Meanwhile, German tanks were already advancing on Smolensk, approaching the borders of the Moscow region. Time was working against the defenders of the capital. But what was this army of volunteers? Who were these people who decided to take up arms against the professional soldiers of the Wehrmacht? Who joined the Moscow People's Militia? Contrary to popular belief, they were not desperate volunteers or marginalized elements of society. The militia was made up of ordinary Soviet citizens, those who formed the backbone of pre-war Moscow. The statistics are striking in their representativeness. The militia included representatives of virtually all professions and social strata. The bulk of them were workers from Moscow's plants and factories. They were skilled specialists, lathe operators, fitters, engineers, and production foremen. Their average age ranged from 25 to 40. Many had families, children, and a familiar, peaceful life. The Lykachev plant provided more than 5,000 men for the militia, and the sickle and hammer plant provided about 4,000. Entire workshops enlisted in the militia almost in their entirety, leaving only a minimum number of specialists to continue military production. A significant part of the militia consisted of employees of various institutions, offices, and stores. Among them were many party and Soviet workers who considered it their duty to set an example for others. Teachers, doctors, engineers, accountants, peaceful professions far removed from military affairs. Some had never held a weapon in their hands, except for a hunting rifle. A special category was made up of young people, students from Moscow universities and technical colleges. Komsomol members joined the militia in whole classes and groups. Moscow University, the Aviation Institute, the Textile Institute. Applications to join the People's Militia came from everywhere. These young men and women were full of romantic ideas about war, drawing images from films and books about the Civil War. There were also veterans among the militia, participants in World War I and the Civil War. There were several thousand of them. They were supposed to become the backbone, passing on their combat experience to the young, but most of them had last fought 20 years ago, when the nature of combat was radically different from modern motorized warfare. Women were not officially recruited into the militia, but many signed up as nurses, signalers, and air defense units. In total, there were about 10,000 women in the ranks of the Moscow militia. But the main mystery was not who joined the militia, but how to create combat-ready military units from this motley crowd of civilians. The organization of the Moscow People's Militia began on a territorial basis. Moscow was divided into districts, each of which was to form its own militia division. In total, it was planned to create 12 divisions by city district: Leningrad, Sokolnicheskaya, Krasnogvardeyskaya, Kirovskaya, and others. Each division was to have about 10,000 people, which corresponded to the standard Red Army Rifle Division. The structure of the People's Militia divisions copied the organization of regular troops, but with significant simplifications. The division consisted of 3 rifle regiments, an artillery regiment, communications units, a sapper battalion, and rear services. On paper, it looked impressive, but the reality turned out to be much more complicated. Not only were there not enough weapons, but there was also a lack of basic knowledge about how to create such an organization. The command of the divisions was entrusted to career officers, but there was a catastrophic shortage of middle-level commanders. Regiment and battalion commanders were often former officers of the Tsarist army who had fought in the Civil War, or party workers with at least minimal military experience. The most authoritative workers, production foremen, and engineers were appointed as company and platoon commanders. A distinctive feature of the organization was that many units were formed on a production basis. Individual companies consisted of workers from the same factory, workshop, or institution. This had its advantages. People knew each other, and a certain discipline and subordination already existed between them. But there were also disadvantages. In the event of heavy losses, entire enterprises could lose a significant part of their skilled personnel. Division headquarters were located in schools, clubs, and district administrative buildings. All organizational work was carried out here: personnel records, distribution among units, and paperwork. The headquarters worked around the clock, as the flow of volunteers did not stop. Every day, new lists arrived from enterprises and institutions. The district authorities and the enterprises themselves were responsible for supplying the divisions. The factories had to not only provide people, but also supply them with uniforms, equipment, and, if possible, weapons. This placed a huge burden on the Moscow economy, which was already overloaded by the military industry. But as practice showed, the biggest problem was not the organization, but the transformation of these formations into a real fighting force. The arming of the Moscow People's Militia became one of the most acute problems. In the early days of the war, the Red Army was in dire need of modern weapons, and it was extremely difficult to allocate a sufficient number of rifles, machine guns, and artillery for the militia. They had to make do with what was available in the reserves, in the warehouses of the Osoaviakim, and in hunting clubs. The main small arms of the militia were Mosin rifles from 1891 to 1930. Many of these rifles had seen action in World War I. The condition of the weapons often left much to be desired. The barrels were worn out, the mechanisms were loose. Precious days and weeks were spent on repairs and maintenance. There was also a shortage of ammunition. Only 30 to 40 rounds were issued per rifle. Machine guns were even rarer. At best, each company had 2 or 3 Degtyaryov light machine guns, often of outdated models. Maxim heavy machine guns were mainly given to machine gun companies, but even these were extremely scarce. Many units received machine guns without spare parts, without sufficient ammunition, and sometimes even without operating instructions. The militia divisions were provided with artillery only symbolically. The artillery regiments were given old guns from World War I, captured weapons, and training models from military schools. Many of the guns required major repairs. There were very few shells for them. Anti-aircraft weapons were practically non-existent. Only a few outdated anti-aircraft machine guns for the entire division. The problem with anti-tank weapons was particularly acute. German tanks posed the main threat, but the militia had practically nothing to counter them with. Anti-tank rifles were issued in small numbers, and anti-tank grenades were rare. The main anti-tank weapon was to be bottles filled with incendiary mixture, which were made on the spot, in the areas where the units were formed. Uniforms were also a problem. There was a shortage of military uniforms, and the militias wore civilian clothes with Red Army insignia sewn on. Some were lucky enough to get t-shirts and trousers, but many went into battle in their jackets and shoes. Helmets were rare. Most often the militias wore ordinary caps or hats. But the biggest drawback was not the lack of specific types of weapons, but the complete absence of modern means of communication, reconnaissance, and troop control. There were practically no radio stations, and communication was carried out through messengers. And yet, they were about to fight against an army equipped with the latest military technology of 1940. Only 3 weeks were allocated for training the volunteers of the People's Militia for combat operations. In this short period of time, civilians had to be turned into soldiers capable of resisting the professional German army. The task seemed impossible, but there was no other option. The enemy was rapidly approaching Moscow. Training took place at training grounds in the vicinity of Moscow, in parks, stadiums, and even factory yards. The training program was drastically reduced and focused on the most essential elements: drill training, weapon training, basic tactics, and trench digging. There was no question of complex military disciplines. There was a catastrophic lack of time. The instructors were career officers, seconded from military academies and units of the Moscow Military District. Many of them had limited combat experience themselves: the war with Finland, the conflicts at Khalkhin Gol. But even that was more than their charges had. Each instructor was responsible for training a company or battalion, which, given the acute lack of time, created an enormous workload. The first days of training took place in a tense atmosphere. Many militiamen were holding combat weapons for the first time in their lives. 40-year-old workers struggled to learn drill commands. Students could not properly assemble an automatic rifle, and elderly employees were overwhelmed by the unfamiliar physical exertion. It seemed that 3 weeks was not a reasonable time frame, but rather a mockery of common sense. However, the positive aspects of the People's Militia gradually began to emerge. Mature, conscientious people learned faster than conscripted soldiers. They understood the seriousness of the situation, so there was no need to waste time on disciplinary measures. Workers accustomed to physical labor easily mastered the art of sappery. Engineers and technicians quickly figured out how weapons worked. Special attention was paid to anti-tank training. Militiamen were taught to make anti-tank mines from improvised materials, use bottles with a flammable mixture, and build anti-tank barriers. This knowledge was supposed to compensate for the lack of special anti-tank weapons. Rifle training was conducted under conditions of severe ammunition shortages. Each militiaman was allowed to fire only 10 to 15 live rounds. The rest of the rifle training was conducted with blanks or training ammunition. Many militiamen went to the front without ever firing a live round from their rifles. But the most difficult part was not technical training, but psychological preparation of people for war. How do you explain to a peaceful person that tomorrow he will have to kill and possibly die? There was no easy answer to this question, and it had to be resolved in battle. The 1st Division of the Moscow People's Militia to engage in actual combat was the Leningrad Division. Formed from residents of the Leningradsky district of Moscow, it numbered about 9,000 people. The main backbone was made up of workers from the Borets and Krasny Bogatyr factories, the Moscow Small Car Factory, employees of various institutions, and students. Colonel Artem Smirnov, a career officer with experience serving in the Tsarist army, took command of the division. His deputy was party worker Boris Vasilyev, who knew the area well and enjoyed authority among the militiamen. This combination of military professionalism and party influence was intended to ensure maximum effectiveness of command. By mid-July, the division had completed its formation and received orders to advance to the defense line near Smolensk. This was the first test of the militia command's organizational abilities. Columns of militiamen stretched for many kilometers along the roads of the Moscow region. There was not enough equipment. So many units moved on foot, carrying their weapons and equipment. The division saw its first combat on July 18th, near the village of Dubrovka. German reconnaissance groups attacked the militia's forward positions. The battle lasted only a few hours, but for most of the militia, it was their first encounter with the enemy. The results were mixed. The enemy was repelled, but the losses among the inexperienced fighters were significant. The commanders quickly realized that 3 weeks of training was clearly not enough. The militiamen had poor orientation skills, were slow to respond to commands, and did not know how to use cover properly. Communication between units was poor, and coordination of actions was lacking. It became clear that it was impossible to fight against regular German units using such methods. But there were also positive moments. The militiamen showed high morale and a willingness to sacrifice themselves. There were almost no cases of desertion, and discipline was maintained through the conscientiousness of the people. Many showed personal bravery, compensating for their lack of military skills. The division's sappers, commanded by engineer Pyotr Kuznetsov, distinguished themselves in particular. Using their industrial experience, they quickly created a system of engineering barriers that seriously slowed the advance of German tanks. This showed that civilian skills could also be applied in military affairs. After the first battles, the division command revised its tactics. It was decided to avoid open clashes with superior enemy forces, to focus on defensive actions, and to use knowledge of the terrain. But the main test for the Leningrad Division was still ahead. The Germans were preparing a decisive offensive on Moscow. The workers' regiments of the People's Militia became a special phenomenon in the history of the Great Patriotic War. Entire factory collectives enlisted in the militia, maintaining their production structure and discipline. The Likhachov factory formed two regiments, the Hammer and Sickle, one reinforced regiment, and the Red Proletarian fielded a separate battalion. This approach had its advantages and disadvantages. The main advantage of the workers' regiments was discipline. People accustomed to the factory routine found it easier to cope with military discipline. There was already a relationship of subordination between them. Foremen became company commanders, and brigadiers became platoon commanders. There was no need to spend time getting people used to each other, as everyone knew the character of their comrades. The workers' regiments were distinguished by their high technical literacy. Locksmiths and turners quickly mastered complex weapons. Electricians became good signalmen, and drivers became military vehicle operators. The factory's engineers developed improvements for weapons and equipment, using the factory's capabilities to produce homemade ammunition and explosives. The regiment of the Likhachov factory, commanded by Major Ivan Petrov, who had worked as the factory's chief engineer before the war, became particularly famous. The regiment was distinguished by its ingenuity in creating anti-tank weapons. Motorists converted several trucks into self-propelled anti-tank guns by installing anti-tank cannons on them. These homemade machines proved to be very effective in the first battles. The Sickle and Hammer Regiment became famous for its sappers. The factory's explosives experts, who had experience working with industrial explosives, created numerous engineering barriers. They learned to make mines from improvised materials, using metallurgical waste as striking elements. The Germans called the regiment's defense areas hellish fields. But the workers' regiments also had serious shortcomings. The main one was their lack of military experience. Production experience could not replace knowledge of tactics, the ability to read the terrain, and combat skills. In the first battles, many units suffered heavy losses due to tactical errors. Another problem was excessive attachment to the factory. Workers' regiments were often assigned to defend their own enterprises, which did not always correspond to the overall defense strategy. Regimental commanders sometimes arbitrarily withdrew units from their positions to protect their home factory from air raids. The loss of entire factory teams was a heavy blow to Moscow's industry. When a regiment was surrounded or suffered heavy losses, the factory lost its most skilled workers. This had a serious impact on the production of military goods. But despite all the difficulties, the workers' regiments showed that Soviet industry could fight not only at the machine tools, but also with weapons in their hands. The student battalions of the Moscow militia became one of the most tragic and heroic formations of the Great Patriotic War. Young people from Moscow universities and technical colleges enlisted in the militia by entire courses and faculties. Moscow University provided more than 2,000 students for the militia. The Aviation Institute provided 1,500, and the Lenin Pedagogical Institute provided over 1,000. The age of most student militiamen ranged from 18 to 22. These were young men and women who were supposed to become the future intelligentsia of the country. Engineers, doctors, teachers, scientists. The war interrupted their peaceful plans and forced them to choose between a rifle and a textbook. Most chose the rifle. The student battalions were distinguished by their high level of education and quick learning. Future engineers easily mastered complex military technology. Medical students became excellent medics, and philologists became translators and signalers. Many spoke foreign languages, which proved useful when interrogating prisoners. The battalion of the Moscow Aviation Institute, commanded by Major Alexander Sokolov, stood out in particular. The battalion had many future pilots and aviation engineers who had a good understanding of air combat tactics. They created an effective air defense system using homemade anti-aircraft guns and well-organized air surveillance. History students from Moscow State University, led by Associate Professor Boris Nikolaev, organized the battalion's intelligence service. Using their knowledge of German and historical knowledge of previous wars, they managed to establish effective cooperation with the local population and obtained valuable information about the enemy. But the students' youth also had serious drawbacks. Their romantic ideas about war, gleaned from books and films, were quickly shattered by the harsh reality. Many young men and women were not prepared for the sight of blood or the need to kill. The first battles were a severe psychological test for them. The students' physical training often left much to be desired. Accustomed to a sedentary lifestyle, they found it difficult to endure long marches, digging trenches, and carrying heavy equipment. Many fell ill in the first weeks of service, but the main tragedy of the student battalions was their enormous losses. Young, inexperienced fighters often showed excessive bravery, went into battle without sufficient training, and did not know how to protect themselves in combat. The battalion of the Aviation Institute lost more than half of its personnel in the first month of fighting. The University Battalion was almost completely destroyed near Vyazma. These losses were irreplaceable for Soviet science and culture. Future aircraft designers, spacecraft creators, great scientists, and writers perished. But their feat showed that Soviet youth were ready to sacrifice their future for the future of their country. The Mojisk defense line was the first serious test for the divisions of the Moscow People's Militia. By mid-October 1941, German troops had broken through the front near Vyazma and were rushing towards Moscow. The only obstacle in their path was the hastily constructed defensive line along the Moskva River near the town of Mojisk. The defense was built on historic battle lines, where Russian troops had stopped Napoleon 200 years earlier. But in 1941, conditions were completely different. German tanks and aircraft left no time to build serious fortifications. They had to use what was at hand: trenches, anti-tank ditches, and log barriers. 4 divisions of the People's Militia advanced to the Mojisk line: Sokolnicheskaya, Krasnopresnenskaya, Kirovskaya, and Leningradskaya. The total number of militiamen reached 35,000. It was an impressive force, but their weapons and training still left much to be desired. The first serious battles began on October 12th, near the village of Borodino. It is symbolic that the militia fought on the same field where the fate of Russia was decided 129 years ago. The German 36th Motorized Infantry Division attacked the positions of the Sokolnicheskaya Militia Division. The battle lasted all day and had mixed results. The militia faced the massive use of German aircraft and tanks for the first time. Stukas dove on the trenches every half hour, methodically destroying defensive positions. German tanks operated skillfully, using the folds of the terrain and infantry cover. Rifles and Molotov cocktails were ineffective against such tactics. But the militia showed remarkable resilience. The workers of the Krasny Proletary factory held their positions to the last man. The Moscow State University Student Battalion repelled 5 attacks by German infantry. Railway signalmen maintained communication between units under continuous artillery fire. The regiment commanded by Colonel Nikolai Volkov, formed from workers in the Sokolnitsky district, distinguished itself in particular. The regiment held positions at an altitude of 172 meters, a key defensive point. The Germans attacked the height 7 times, but the militia held it, although they lost more than 70% of their personnel. By the evening of October 14th, it became clear that it would not be possible to hold the Mojisk line. German tanks broke through the defenses in several places, and individual units began to be surrounded. An order was given to retreat to new defensive lines. But 3 days of fighting on the Mojisk line showed that the People's Militia could fight against regular German troops and inflict serious losses on them. The main result of the battles near Mojisk was not the territory that could not be held, but the time that was gained. 3 days of defense allowed fresh reserves to be brought to Moscow, the population and enterprises to be evacuated, and new defensive lines to be created. The militia paid for this time with their blood. The Vyazma operation became the most tragic page in the history of the Moscow People's Militia. In early October 1941, German troops launched Operation Typhoon, a decisive offensive on Moscow. The main blow fell on the troops of the Western and Reserve fronts in the area of the city of Vyazma. Several divisions of the People's Militia also found themselves in this meat grinder. The situation developed catastrophically. German tank wedges broke through the Soviet defenses in several places at once. Command of the troops was disrupted, and communication between units was lost. By October 7th, it became clear that a large group of Soviet troops, including militia divisions, had been surrounded west of Vyazma. The Krasnopresnenskaya and Kirovskaya militia divisions, numbering about 18,000 men, found themselves in the cauldron. They were workers from Moscow factories, office workers, students, teachers, people who, just 3 months earlier, had been living peaceful lives. Now they were about to go through one of the most terrible episodes of the war. The command of the encircled group attempted to organize a breakthrough. But the militia divisions were not ready for this. They lacked ammunition, food, and medicine. Many militiamen were wounded or sick. There was virtually no radio communication, making it impossible to coordinate the actions of the various units. The first attempts to break through were made on October 8th to 9th, but they all ended in failure. The Germans created a tight encirclement, which they methodically tightened. The German Air Force was particularly effective, shooting down columns of retreating troops with virtually no repercussions. The situation of the militiamen was exacerbated by the fact that they were less prepared than regular troops for action in an encirclement. Many did not know how to navigate in the forest, find food, or provide first aid. The city dwellers found themselves in a completely unfamiliar environment. The autumn forests outside Moscow, where every day became a struggle for survival. The situation was particularly difficult for the Krasnopresnenskaya division. The division was split into several isolated groups, each of which acted independently. A group commanded by Major Pyotr Semenov, consisting of workers from the Krasny Bogatyr factory, attempted to break through to the south, but ran into a German ambush near the village of Bogoroditskoye. The Kirov division found itself in an even more difficult situation. Its commander, Colonel Vladimir Rusanov, was seriously wounded on the first day of the encirclement, and the division's command effectively collapsed. Individual regiments and battalions acted separately, without a common plan for a breakthrough. The heroism of the militiamen in the encirclement was evident in hundreds of little-known episodes. A student battalion under the command of Lieutenant Alexei Morozov held a small village for 2 weeks, covering the exit of their wounded comrades. Workers from the Frunze factory, led by foreman Ivan Kozlov, set up an improvised hospital in the forest and treated the wounded from various units for 2 weeks. Attempts at an organized breakthrough were made until October 20th. The largest was attempted on October 15th by the combined remnants of 2 divisions under the command of Colonel Andrei Vlasov. The breakthrough began at 4 in the morning with the support of the last artillery shells. They managed to advance a few kilometers, but by evening, the offensive had stalled. By the end of October, organized resistance in the cauldron had ceased. Most of the militiamen were killed or captured. Only small groups managed to reach their troops. Of the 18,000 militiamen surrounded, less than 2,000 reached Soviet positions. The rest joined the tragic list of victims of the Vyazma catastrophe. But even this tragedy had its own meaning. 2 weeks of heroic resistance by the militiamen in the encirclement tied down significant German forces, which were unable to participate in the offensive on Moscow. Every day won at the cost of the lives of the militiamen worked to organize the defense of the capital. The price of popular resistance was terrible. By the end of October 1941, the Moscow People's Militia had suffered enormous losses. Of the 12 divisions originally formed, only 4 remained combat-ready. Total losses exceeded 150,000 people, killed, wounded, and missing. The youth suffered particularly heavy losses. The student battalions were almost completely destroyed. Moscow University lost more than half of the students and teachers who had enlisted in the militia. The Aviation Institute lost an entire generation of future aircraft designers. The Pedagogical Institute lost most of its senior students, future teachers. The tragedy also affected the workers' regiments. The Likhachov factory lost more than 3,000 of its workers. The Hammer and Sickle lost almost its entire blacksmith shop, which had enlisted in the militia almost in its entirety. The Moscow small car factory lost half of its engineering and technical workers. The losses of command personnel were particularly painful. More than half of the regimental and battalion commanders were killed or went missing. Many of them were experienced specialists, engineers, teachers, party workers. Their deaths were an irreplaceable loss not only for the army, but for the entire Soviet society. The families of the militiamen experienced a particular tragedy. Unlike the families of career military personnel, they were not morally prepared for the possible death of their loved ones. The wives, children, and parents of the militiamen hoped until the very end that the war would not affect them, that their husband, son, or father would return home alive and unharmed. The uncertainty surrounding the fate of those missing in action was particularly difficult. After the Vyazma operation, thousands of families did not know whether their loved ones were alive, captured, or dead. Official death notices did not arrive immediately, and many families lived in agonizing anticipation of news for months. But the losses of the militia had another hidden side. It was not just people who died. It was the bearers of certain professions, skills, and knowledge. Moscow's industry lost thousands of skilled workers just when they were most needed for the production of military goods. Science and education suffered irreparable damage. The students and teachers who died could have become the creators of post-war technology, scientists, doctors, and teachers. Their deaths meant not only a human tragedy, but also a loss of the country's intellectual potential. The heroism of the militiamen was evident in thousands of episodes. They went on the attack under German machine gun fire, blew themselves up with grenades along with German tanks, and remained in their positions until the last bullet. Many performed feats equal to those of professional soldiers, but their names remained unknown. The memory of these victims became one of the most important factors mobilizing Muscovites to continue the fight. The death of comrades, neighbors, and colleagues showed all residents of the capital that war was not distant battles somewhere on the border, but a struggle for the life of every family, every home, every street. But despite the terrible losses, the formation of the People's Militia continued. Despite the huge losses of the first formation, at the end of October, beginning of November 1941, the second formation of the People's Militia divisions began. German troops were at the gates of Moscow, and every man capable of bearing arms was worth his weight in gold. The decision to recruit new troops was made in a critical situation, when the fate of the capital hung in the balance. The second formation took place under completely different conditions. While in the summer people had enlisted in the militia under the influence of patriotic fervor, now their motives were much more pragmatic. Muscovites saw columns of refugees, heard artillery fire, and understood that the enemy was at the gates. The choice was simple: fight or submit. The contingent of the second draft differed significantly from the first. The bulk of it consisted of older people, aged 40 to 55, who in the summer had been considered too old for military service. Now the age restrictions had been lifted. Workers from defense factories that had not been evacuated in time signed up for the militia. Women made up a significant part of the contingent. While they had accounted for about 10% of the first formation, now they made up almost a third. Women militiamen became snipers, signalers, anti-aircraft gunners, and nurses. Many of them had special education, engineers, doctors, teachers, who could be no less useful to the army than men. The training of the second formation was carried out under conditions of extreme time pressure. The training lasted not 3 weeks, as in the summer, but only 10 days. The program was reduced to a minimum: the ability to shoot, dig trenches, and provide first aid. There was no question of complex tactical training. The second formation's weapons were even worse than the first. The rifles were mainly captured weapons: Polish, French, and even Austrian from World War I. Each rifle came with ammunition of different calibers, which created additional difficulties. There were practically no machine guns, let alone artillery. A distinctive feature of the second formation was the widespread use of homemade weapons. Faced with a shortage of standard weapons, the militiamen mass-produced homemade guns, explosives, and anti-tank mines from whatever materials they could find. Moscow factories that had not yet been evacuated worked on creating the simplest weapons for the militia. The command structure of the second formation was recruited from completely different sources. Some of the commanders were surviving officers from the first formation who had been baptized in battle. Others were cadets from military academies who had been sent to the front ahead of schedule. The third group consisted of civilian specialists who had demonstrated organizational skills. The morale of the second formation was mixed. On the one hand, people understood the critical nature of the moment and were ready to fight to the end. On the other hand, news of the fate of the 1st Militia Divisions had a depressing effect. Many enlisted in the militia without illusions, realizing that their chances of survival were slim. The formation of new divisions took place under constant German air raids. Assembly points had to be changed, and training had to be conducted in basements and bomb shelters. Some units saw combat before they were even fully formed, repelling enemy air raids on Moscow factories and train stations. But time was running out. The new militia divisions were preparing for decisive battles for the capital. The Battle of Moscow became the moment of glory for the People's Militia. By December 1941, the troops defending the capital included 7 militia divisions with a total strength of about 60,000 men. This was no longer the amateur organization of the summer, but battle-hardened units capable of fighting on equal terms with regular troops. The militia played a special role in defending the southern approaches to Moscow. Here, in the Tula and Kashira area, the 2nd Formation divisions took up positions in the direction of the main attack by Guderian's German tank group. The enemy expected to quickly break through the positions of the second-rate units and reach Moscow from the south. But the Germans miscalculated. The militiamen fought with the desperation of the doomed, realizing that there was nowhere else to retreat. Moscow was behind them. The Kashira Militia Division, commanded by Colonel Dmitry Lebedev, stopped the German tanks near the town of Kashira, turning it into an impregnable fortress. The Tula Militia Division joined in the heroic defense of the city of gunsmiths. The workers of the Tula Arms Factory, who had enlisted in the militia, defended their city with particular tenacity. They knew every street and every house, turning their hometown into a labyrinth of fortifications and ambushes. The Khimki Militia Division distinguished itself on the northern approaches to Moscow. In the area of the Moscow Canal, the militia stopped the German units that had broken through closest to the capital. The fighting was for every house, every bridge. The division commander, Major General Ivan Petrov, who had worked as the director of a chemical plant before the war, showed remarkable military talent. The railway militia distinguished themselves in particular. Workers at Moscow depots and stations created special armored trains that operated on the approaches to the capital. These homemade combat vehicles, created from locomotives and carriages, became a formidable weapon against German infantry and light tanks. During the German offensive, the militia showed wonders of ingenuity. There was a shortage of anti-tank weapons, so they made mines from shells dating back to World War I. There were no anti-aircraft guns, so they created anti-aircraft installations from Maxim machine guns. Barriers were needed, so they built anti-tank ditches by hand, often under enemy fire. The December counteroffensive near Moscow was a triumph for the People's Militia. Divisions that had recently struggled to hold their defenses went on the offensive alongside regular units. The militia liberated the same settlements they had left 2 months earlier. The offensive showed that the militia had not only learned to defend themselves, but could also attack. However, the losses in the offensive battles were very high. The lack of experience and weapons also affected the offensive. But the moral effect was enormous. The People's Army drove the invincible Wehrmacht from the walls of the capital. The Battle of Moscow was a test of maturity for the People's Militia. This test was passed with flying colors. The militiamen proved that they could not only die for their homeland, but also defeat the enemy. Their contribution to the victory near Moscow was recognized by the command. and soon the militia divisions were in for some big changes. By the spring of 1942, the Moscow People's Militia had undergone a complete transformation, from civilian volunteers to battle-hardened warriors. The victory near Moscow showed that the militia could fight on a par with regular troops. The question arose about the future of these formations, and a radical decision was made to transform the militia divisions into units of the Red Army. The transformation began in March 1942. Officially, the People's Militia Divisions were renamed Guards Rifle Divisions and were assigned numbers and battle flags. This was a recognition of their combat merits and equalized their rights with those of the regular Army units. The transformation process was complex and painful. The divisions were replenished with regular officers, received standard weapons, and underwent retraining according to the regulations of the Red Army. Many militia commanders who had proven themselves in battle retained their posts, but they had to undergo accelerated military training courses. Rearming was particularly difficult. The divisions received modern rifles, submachine guns, machine guns, and artillery. But by this time, many militiamen had already become accustomed to their assorted weapons, knowing their characteristics and quirks. The transition to new weapons required time and additional training. The structure of the divisions also changed. Instead of a simplified militia organization, full-fledged rifle divisions with artillery regiments, engineer battalions, communications, and rear units were introduced. This increased combat effectiveness, but required additional personnel and equipment. The divisions were replenished with conscripts and volunteers from other regions. The old militiamen became the backbone of the units, passing on their combat experience to the newcomers. But this changed the spirit of the divisions. They became ordinary army units, losing their special militia atmosphere. Some of the militia veterans were recalled to the rear to work in defense enterprises. Moscow was in dire need of skilled workers, and many militiamen were irreplaceable specialists. Their return to the factories was as important to victory as their service in the army. Some divisions maintained ties with their enterprises and districts. Factories continued to sponsor their units, supplying additional equipment and repairing machinery. This connection between the front and the rear became one of the distinctive features of the Soviet military system. The transformed divisions participated in all major operations of the Great Patriotic War. Former Moscow militiamen fought at Stalingrad, on the Kursk Bulge, liberated Ukraine and Belarus, and stormed Berlin. Many of them rose to high ranks and became heroes of the Soviet Union. But the transformation also meant the end of the People's Militia as a special phenomenon. The romance of the early days, when workers and students signed up to defend their homeland, gave way to everyday army service. The militia had fulfilled its historic task. It had given the country time to mobilize all its forces. By the summer of 1942, the Moscow People's Militia had ceased to exist. In its place were regular units of the Red Army, manned according to wartime staffing levels. But the memory of the 400,000 volunteers who rose to defend the capital will forever remain in the history of the Great Patriotic War. The significance of the Moscow People's Militia in the history of the Great Patriotic War cannot be overestimated. The 400,000 volunteers who enlisted in the militia in the summer and fall of 1941 played a key role in defending the capital and the entire country. Their feat became a symbol of the unity of the people and the army in the fight against the fascist invasion. The militia's main contribution to victory was buying time. During the critical months of summer and autumn 1941, when the regular army suffered heavy losses, the people's militias filled the gaps in the defense. Every day, one, at the cost of the lives of militiamen, worked to mobilize industry, evacuate the population and enterprises, and prepare reserves. The militia demonstrated to the world the character of the Soviet people. Western observers were amazed at the willingness of civilians to take up arms and go into battle against professional soldiers. This refuted German calculations that the Soviet Union would quickly collapse under the blows of the Wehrmacht. The experience of the Moscow militia was used in other cities and regions of the country. Following the example of the Moscow divisions, people's militias were created in Leningrad, Stalingrad, Tula, and Voronezh. The total number of all formations of the people's militia exceeded 1 million people. The tragedy of the militia was its enormous losses. Of the 400,000 who enlisted, about 250,000 were killed or went missing. This was the price of unpreparedness, lack of weapons, and lack of time for training. But these sacrifices were not in vain. They saved Moscow and the country. The social consequences of the formation of the militia proved to be long-lasting. The war erased many pre-war social differences and united people of different professions and ages with a common goal. Workers and intellectuals, young people and old people fought side by side, which changed the structure of Soviet society. The militia became a school of military affairs for the civilian population. Hundreds of thousands of people acquired military skills, learned how to handle weapons, and became familiar with the basics of tactics. This experience was useful not only at the front, but also in the partisan struggle and in the work of the fighter battalions. Moscow's industrial potential suffered serious damage from the losses among the militia. Thousands of skilled workers, engineers, and technicians were killed. Many enterprises lost entire teams. This affected the production of military products, although the heroism of the remaining workers compensated for the losses. The memory of the Moscow militia has been preserved in street names, monuments, and museum exhibits. But the main memory is that Moscow did not fall, that the enemy was stopped at the walls of the capital. 400,000 volunteers who stood up to defend their homeland at a critical moment played a significant role in this victory. The lessons of the Moscow militia are still relevant today. They show that at critical moments in history, it is not only the professional army that plays a decisive role, but also the willingness of the people to sacrifice themselves. Patriotism, unity, and a willingness to defend one's land. These qualities were fully manifested during the days of the Moscow militia. The history of the people's militia is the history of ordinary people who performed extraordinary feats. Workers and employees, students and teachers, young and old. All of them showed that in the face of mortal danger, the line between the front and the rear disappears, and every citizen becomes a soldier of their homeland.